The last thing Margaret Sullivan saw with her own eyes was her husband's face twisted in disgust as he turned away from her hospital bed. She didn't know then that it would be the last image burned into her memory, his retreating figure, way his shoulders hunched forward as if carrying shame itself. The sound of his footsteps echoing down the hospital corridor like a countdown to abandonment. But sometimes, the cruelest mercy is losing sight of the thing that would break your heart to keep seeing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1952 had arrived in Cedar Falls, Iowa, with the kind of crisp promise that made housewives hang their washing on lines that stretched between elm trees like prayer flags against the sky. Margaret had been one of those women, just months before 28 years old, with auburn hair that caught sunlight like copper wire, and hands that knew the weight of fresh bread dough, the precise temperature of bath water for her 2 young children. She had been ordinary in the quoted, most beautiful way. The kind of woman who hummed while she ironed her husband's work shirts, who could stretch a pot roast to feed unexpected dinner guests, who knew exactly how much starch to put in curtains so they'd hang just right in the front window. Her life had been measured in small, perfect rituals. Coffee at dawn with Robert, before he left for the insurance office. Afternoon stories read to 4-year-old Timothy and 6-year-old Sarah. Evening walks around the neighborhood where she'd wave to Mrs. Henderson watering her roses and exchange pleasantries about the weather. The smallpox had come like a thief in the night, though not really at night at all. It had arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, disguised as what Margaret thought was just fatigue. She'd been feeling run down for days, attributing it to the busy season of preserving peaches and preparing the children's winter clothes. When the fever started, she told herself it was just a cold coming on. Robert had been practical about it in his methodical way. "You should rest," he'd said, adjusting his tie in the bedroom mirror. "I'll ask Mrs. Garrett next door to look after the children today." He'd kissed her forehead, the last time his lips would ever touch her skin, and gone off to work, briefcase in hand, confident that his wife's minor illness would resolve itself with the efficiency he expected from all of life's inconveniences. But the fever didn't break. It climbed higher, turning her skin into a furnace that the cool September air couldn't temper. When the first lesions appeared on her arms, small and barely noticeable, Margaret had stared at them in the bathroom mirror with more curiosity than alarm. She'd seen chicken pox before, had nursed both children through it the previous winter. This wasn't chicken pox. Dr. Pemberton had arrived at the house with his black medical bag and grave expression, summoned by Mrs. Garrett, who'd grown worried when Margaret hadn't answered her knocking that morning. The children had been playing in the backyard, their laughter drifting through the windows like music from another world. A world where mothers didn't collapse on kitchen floors while trying to make lunch. "It's smallpox," Dr. Pemberton had said to Robert that evening, the words falling between them like stones dropped into still water. She'd need to be hospitalized immediately, quarantined. Margaret remembered the way Robert's face had changed in that moment, the careful composure he wore to work each day cracking like ice under pressure. His eyes had found hers across the living room where she lay bundled in blankets on the sofa, and she'd seen something die there, not love, exactly, but the comfortable assumption of love's permanence. The ride to the hospital had been silent, except for the sound of tires on wet asphalt and Robert's fingers drumming against the steering wheel. Margaret had pressed her face to the car window, watching the familiar streets of Cedar Falls blur past, not knowing she was memorizing them. The maple trees were just beginning to turn, their leaves holding onto summer's green while surrender crept in at the edges in shades of gold and rust. St. Mary's Hospital rose before them like a red brick fortress against the gray October sky. Robert had helped her from the car with the careful distance of someone handling something fragile and potentially dangerous. His touch was gentle but brief, his hand settling on her elbow and back only long enough to guide her up the front. Steps before pulling away again. The isolation ward smelled of carbolic acid and fear. Margaret's room was small and white, with a single window that looked out onto the hospital's back courtyard, where maintenance workers burned trash in metal drums. She'd lain in the narrow bed watching smoke curl up into the autumn sky, listening to the muffled sounds of the hospital around her nurse's shoes on linoleum, the distant ring of telephones, the whispered conversations that stopped when she strained to hear them. The lesions had spread with methodical cruelty. They appeared on her face first, small raised bumps that made her look as though she'd been caught in a hailstorm. Then they multiplied, covering her arms, her chest, her neck, transforming her familiar body into something foreign and frightening. The mirror above the small wash basin became her enemy, reflecting back a face she didn't recognize, swollen, disfigured, monstrous. Robert visited twice in the first week. He'd sat in the chair beside her bed, with his hat balanced on his knees, talking about practical things. The children were staying with his sister Eleanor in Des Moines until the danger of contagion passed. He'd spoken to his supervisor about taking time off work. The neighbors were asking about her, sending their prayers. He didn't look directly at her during these visits. His eyes found the window, the floor, his own hands folded in his lap, anywhere but her face. When she tried to reach for him, he'd shifted in his chair, not quite pulling away but not moving closer either. "The children," she'd whispered through lips that had begun to crack and swell. "Are they frightened?" "Eleanor's keeping them busy," he'd replied, still not meeting her eyes. "Timothy asks when you're coming home. And Sarah?" A pause. "She's drawing pictures for you. Eleanor says she draws you every day." Margaret had closed her eyes then, trying to picture her daughter's drawings, stick figures with triangle dresses and circle faces crowned with scribbled hair. Did Sarah draw her as she used to be, or as she was becoming? The fever dreams had started during the second week. Margaret would drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes thinking she was at home making breakfast, sometimes believing she was a child again in her mother's kitchen learning to knead bread. The worst dreams were the ones where she could see clearly vivid, detailed visions of her life before, so real she could smell the lavender sachets in her dresser, drawers, and feel the weight of Timothy's head against her shoulder during bedtime. Stories. She would wake from these dreams to the stark reality of the hospital room, her hands instinctively moving to her face to touch the rough, scabbed surface that had once been smooth skin. The lesions had begun to affect her eyes by then, causing them to swell nearly shut. The world had started to narrow, becoming first a tunnel of blurred shapes and muted colors, then something even smaller, patches of light and shadow, the vague outlines of nurses moving around her bed like ghosts in white uniforms. Dr. Pemberton had been kind but honest. "The infection has spread to your eyes," he'd explained, his voice floating to her from somewhere beyond the growing darkness. "We're doing everything we can, but you need to prepare yourself for the possibility of permanent damage, permanent damage." The words had echoed in her head like a prayer she didn't want to finish. She'd known what he meant without him having to say it. The smallpox was stealing her sight, 1 degree of clarity at a time, like someone slowly turning down the brightness on a lamp until only the memory of light remained. Robert's last visit had come on a Thursday evening in late October. Margaret had heard his footsteps in the hallway. She'd learned to recognize the particular rhythm of his walk, the way he favored his left foot since the old football injury. But when he entered her room, she could only make out the vague outline of his figure standing in the doorway. "Margaret?" His voice had been different somehow, hollow and distant, as if he were speaking to her from the bottom of a well. She'd turned her head toward the sound, her hands smoothing the hospital blanket across her lap. "I'm here, Robert. I'm still here." But even as she said it, she'd known that wasn't what he wanted to hear. He'd wanted her to be gone, not dead, exactly, but absent in a way that would make his leaving easier to bear. He'd moved closer to the bed, and she'd caught the familiar scent of his aftershave. The one she'd given him last Christmas that smelled like cedar and something else she could never quite name. For a moment, she'd thought he might take her hand, might sit down in the bedside chair and tell her about the children, about his work, about the ordinary details of the life that was continuing without her. Instead, he'd cleared his throat and said, "I've spoken to Eleanor. The children are settling in well with her family." "That's good," Margaret had whispered, though something in his tone had made her stomach clench with a fear that had nothing to do with her illness. "She's agreed to keep them, permanently." The words had hit her like cold water. "What do you mean, permanently?" Robert had shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the floorboards creaking beneath him. "Margaret, you have to understand, I can't, we can single quotes this isn't what I signed up for." She'd felt her world tilt on its axis, the familiar boundaries of her life suddenly becoming fluid and uncertain. "Robert, I don't understand. I'm going to get better. The doctor says you'll likely never see again." His voice had been flat, matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of gasoline. "You'll need constant care. The children, they can't see you like this. It would traumatize them." Margaret had reached out blindly, her hands searching the space between them for some part of him to hold on to. Her fingers had found nothing but air. "Please," she'd whispered, "please don't do this. We can figure it out. I can learn." "No." The single word had cut through her pleading like a blade. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. Eleanor will adopt the children. She and Harold have the space, the resources. They'll have a proper family. I'm their mother." The words had come out as barely more than breath, but they'd carried the weight of every lullaby she'd ever sung, every scraped knee she'd kissed, every bedtime story she'd whispered in the dark. "You were their mother," Robert had corrected, and Margaret had heard him moving toward the door. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I truly am, but I can't sacrifice my entire life for this." She'd heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway, growing fainter with each step until they were swallowed by the general noise of the hospital. Only then had she realized she was crying not the quiet, dignified tears she'd shed during the worst of her illness, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from someplace inside her she hadn't known existed. The nurse had found her hours later, still crying, her hands clutched around the edge of the hospital blanket as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. The woman had been gentle, offering tissues and water and the kind of soft, meaningless comfort that healthcare workers learn to dispense like medicine. "Is there someone we can call for you, dear?" the nurse had asked. "Family? Friends?" Margaret had tried to think of anyone who might come. Her parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. She had a sister in California, but they'd grown apart after Margaret's marriage, their correspondence reduced to Christmas cards and brief notes on birthdays. Robert's family had never fully accepted her, viewing her as an outsider who'd somehow tricked their golden boy into marriage. "No," she'd whispered into the darkness that had become her permanent companion. "There's no one." The days that followed had blurred together in a haze of grief and adjustment. Margaret had learned to navigate her small room by touch, counting steps from the bed to the chair to the wash basin. She discovered that sound took on new dimensions when sight was gone. She could distinguish between the day nurse and the night nurse by the rhythm of their footsteps, could tell the time of day by the quality of voices in the hallway. Dr. Pemberton had visited regularly, tracking her recovery from the smallpox while gently introducing her to the reality of her new circumstances. The lesions were healing, leaving behind a landscape of scars that would mark her face forever. Her sight was gone completely now, the infection having damaged her corneas beyond repair. "There are places," he'd said carefully during one of their conversations, "facilities where people in your situation can learn to adjust, to live independently." Margaret had turned her face toward the window, though she could no longer see the view that had once comforted her. What kind of places? Schools. Training centers. There's one in Iowa City that has an excellent reputation. They teach skills mobility, reading Braille, household management. Many of their graduates go on to live quite normal lives. Normal, the word had tasted bitter in her mouth. What was normal about a world without color, without the faces of her children, without the simple joy of watching sunrise paint the sky? What was normal about being abandoned by the person who had promised to love her in sickness and in health? But what choice did she have? The hospital couldn't keep her indefinitely, and she had nowhere else to go. Robert had made sure of that. Their house was already up for sale. He'd told her through Dr. Pemberton, the proceeds to be divided between them, though she wondered how much would actually find its way to her. On her last night at St. Mary's, Margaret had lain awake, listening to the sounds of the hospital settling into quiet around her. Somewhere down the hall, a woman was crying softly. Outside her window, she could hear the wind moving through the bare branches of the oak trees that lined the parking lot. She'd thought about her children then, Timothy with his gap-toothed grin and endless questions about how things worked. Sarah with her serious eyes and the way she'd always crawled into Margaret's lap during thunderstorms. Were they sleeping peacefully in Eleanor's house, or were they staring at the ceiling, wondering why their mother had disappeared from their lives, as suddenly as if she'd never existed at all? The admission papers for the Iowa City facility had been signed, the arrangements made. Tomorrow she would begin the journey toward whatever version of life awaited her on the other side of this darkness. She would learn to live without sight, without family, without the comfortable certainties that had once defined her existence. But tonight, in the quiet hours before dawn, Margaret Sullivan allowed herself to grieve for everything she'd lost. Not just her vision, but her identity as a wife and mother, her place in the world, her faith in the endurance of love. She cried until there were no tears left, until exhaustion finally pulled her into a dreamless sleep that offered no glimpse of the light she would never see again. When morning came, it would mark the beginning of her education in darkness. But it would also, though she couldn't know it yet, mark the first step toward discovering that sometimes the most profound sight comes not through the eyes, but through the transformed vision of a heart that has learned to see in ways it never imagined possible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Iowa State School for the Blind sat like a fortress of red brick and good intentions on the outskirts of Iowa City, its windows catching the weak November sunlight like 100 watchful eyes. Margaret had arrived there on a gray Tuesday morning, her few possessions packed into a single suitcase that seemed to mock the life she'd once lived, a life that had required closets full of clothes, kitchen drawers crammed with utensils, and photo albums thick with memories. The taxi driver had been kind, describing the building to her as they pulled up the circular drive. "Big place," he'd said, his voice tinged with the careful sympathy strangers offered when they didn't know what else to say. "Looks well maintained. Lots of trees around it, though they're bare now. Probably pretty in spring." Margaret had nodded, though spring felt like a foreign concept, something that happened to other people in other lives. She'd pressed her face to the cool window glass, trying to catch some impression of her new surroundings through the shadows and shapes that had become her limited visual world. All she could make out were vague geometries of light and dark, the suggestion of scale without detail. Miss Catherine Walsh met them at the entrance, her voice crisp and efficient as a fresh apple. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm the director here. We've been expecting you." Her handshake was firm, businesslike, but not unkind. "Let me help you with your things." The interior of the school smelled of floor wax and institutional cooking, underscored by something Margaret couldn't immediately identify: leather, maybe, or the particular mustiness of old books. Her footsteps echoed differently here then. They had in the hospital, the sound absorbed by carpet in some places, ringing off tile in others. The building was constructed in 1912. Miss Walsh explained as she guided Margaret down what seemed to be a long corridor. We house about 60 residents at present. Some are students learning basic skills. Others are here for more advanced training. We also have a workshop program for those who wish to learn trades. They passed through what Miss Walsh described. As the common area, Margaret could hear voices, the soft shuffle of movement. The click of what she would later learn were canes tapping against furniture and walls. Someone was playing piano in the distance, scales running up and down like water over stones. Your room is on the second floor, Miss Walsh continued, leading her to an elevator that groaned and wheezed as it carried them upward. You'll be sharing with Mrs. Dorothy Chun. She's been with us about 6 months now, lost her sight in a factory accident. Very sweet woman, originally from San Francisco. The room was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds, 2 dressers, and a single window that Miss Walsh positioned Margaret beside. The view looks out over the courtyard, she explained. There's a garden there where some of our residents grow vegetables. You might find the sounds peaceful: birds, wind in the trees. Margaret sat on the edge of what would be her bed, her hands exploring the rough texture of the institutional blanket. How long do people usually stay? That depends entirely on the individual, Miss Walsh replied, settling into a chair that creaked under her weight. Some of our residents master the basic skills in 6 months and move on to independent living. Others find they need more time or discover they prefer the community here. We don't rush anyone. That evening, Margaret met Dorothy Chun at dinner in the communal dining hall. Dorothy was 42, with a voice that carried traces of her California childhood and hands that moved with surprising confidence as she navigated the meal. She'd been a seamstress before her accident, she explained, working in one of San Francisco's garment factories when a steam press malfunctioned and filled the air with scalding vapor. The worst part isn't the darkness, Dorothy said as they sat together after the meal, speaking in the frank way that people with shared troubles often do. It's the way everyone thinks your whole life is over. Like blindness erased everything you were before. Margaret had nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It was the pity in voices, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the assumption that she had become something less than fully human. What do you miss most? Margaret asked. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Fabric, she said finally. I could tell the quality of material just by looking at it. The way silk caught light differently than cotton. How you could see the weight of wool in its drape. I still have good hands for texture, but it's not the same. There was something about seeing it that made me understand what I was working with. Over the following weeks, Margaret began to learn the geography of her new world. The school operated on a strict schedule: breakfast at 7, morning classes from 8 to 11, lunch at noon, afternoon sessions from 1 to 4, dinner at 6, and structured evening activities until 9. It was a life measured in increments. Each day identical to the last. Her first instructor was Mr. James Hawthorne, a patient man in his 50s who had been teaching mobility skills for over 20 years. The cane isn't a crutch, Mrs. Sullivan, he explained during their initial lesson. It's information. It tells you about texture, obstacles, changes in elevation. Think of it as extending your sense of touch. Learning to navigate with the white cane was frustrating and humiliating in equal measure. Margaret had always been graceful, the kind of woman who could cross a crowded room without disturbing so much as a chair. Now she bumped into walls, misjudged distances, and found herself turned around in hallways she thought she knew. Everyone struggles at first, Mr. Hawthorne assured her after a particularly disastrous lesson where she'd knocked over a potted plant and gotten tangled in the chain of a ceiling fan. Your brain is learning to process information in completely new ways. It takes time. But time felt like something Margaret had lost along with her sight. Back home, though she had to stop thinking of Cedar Falls as home her days had been. Full of purpose and variety. Here, each morning brought the same routine, the same lessons, the same careful encouragement from instructors who meant well, but couldn't understand the magnitude of what she'd lost. The Braille lessons were perhaps the most challenging. Her instructor, Mrs. Elizabeth Norris, was a tiny woman with infinite patience and fingers that moved across the raised dots like a pianist reading music. "Your fingertips need to develop sensitivity," she explained. "Most people who see rely too heavily on sight for everything. You're learning to make your hands into eyes." Margaret's fingers, once skilled at kneading bread and braiding her daughter's hair, felt clumsy and thick as she traced the patterns of dots that were supposed to represent letters and words. The alphabet she'd known since childhood became foreign territory, each letter a puzzle to be solved through touch rather than recognized through sight. "Don't press so hard," Mrs. Norris would remind her gently. "The dots aren't going anywhere. Let your fingers float over them, like you're reading silk." Progress came in tiny increments. One day, Margaret successfully navigated from her room to the dining hall without assistance. Another day, she read an entire sentence in Braille without having to go back and recheck letters. Small victories that would have been invisible to her old life, but felt monumental in her new one. The other residents formed a loose community united by shared experience and mutual understanding. There was Mr. Franklin Torres, a former railroad worker who'd lost his sight in a switching accident and now worked in the school's broom-making shop. Mrs. Ruth Kowalski had been blinded by diabetes and spent her days learning household management skills she'd once taken for granted. Young Tommy Morrison, barely 18, had been born blind and served as an unofficial guide for newer residents. His cheerful confidence a reminder that blindness didn't have to mean the end of joy. "You're getting stronger," Dorothy observed. One evening as they sat in the common room listening to a radio program. "When you first arrived, you moved like you were afraid the world was going to hit you. Now you move like you belong in it." Margaret considered this. It was true that she felt less fragile than she had in those first weeks, less likely to shatter at the slightest unexpected touch or sound. But stronger? She wasn't sure. She felt more like someone learning to live in a foreign country where she would never quite master the language. The hardest times came at night, when the structured activities ended and she was left alone with her thoughts. She would lie in her narrow bed listening to Dorothy's gentle snoring and let her mind wander to Timothy and Sarah. Were they doing well in school? Had Sarah lost any more teeth? Did Timothy still ask endless questions about how airplanes stayed in the sky? Sometimes she imagined conversations with them, mentally composing letters she would never write because she didn't have their address and wasn't sure Eleanor would welcome contact. In these imaginary exchanges, she tried to explain why she had disappeared from their lives, but the words always felt inadequate. How do you tell a 4-year-old that Mommy went away because Daddy couldn't look at her anymore? Winter settled over Iowa City with the kind of cold that made buildings creak and forced people to walk with their shoulders hunched against the wind. Margaret learned to recognize the changing seasons not through visual cues, but through the quality of air that came through the window, the sounds of footsteps on different surfaces, the way voices carried in cold air versus warm. One afternoon in December, as she sat in the common room practicing her Braille reader, she heard new footsteps. In the hallway, measured, deliberate, accompanied by the distinctive sound of a cane used by someone who had long since made peace with its necessity. The steps paused at the entrance to the common room. "Excuse me," a man's voice said, deep and slightly roughened by what might have been tobacco or simply years of use. "I'm looking for Miss Walsh. I was told she might be in here." "Office is down the hall, 3rd door on the right," Tommy Morrison called out cheerfully. "But she's in meetings all afternoon. Can I help you with something? I'm supposed to start work here Monday. Thought I'd introduce myself, get the lay of the land." The voice moved closer, and Margaret caught a scent of winter air and something else, leather, maybe, and the faint aroma of coffee. Name's Samuel Brooks. I'll be helping with the workshop program. Margaret's fingers stilled on her braille reader. There was something about the voice that commanded attention, not through volume or authority, but through a quality of measured calm that suggested its owner had seen things, experienced things, and come through them with his essential humanity intact. Workshop program's great, Tommy said enthusiastically. You'll be working with Mr. Torres mostly. He knows everything about making brooms, and Mrs. Peterson teaches bookbinding. What's your background? Army, Samuel Brooks replied simply. Lost my sight in Korea. Spent some time learning skills, figured I'd pass them along. Korea, Margaret's breath caught slightly. The war had ended just 2 years ago, and the newspapers had been full of stories about wounded veterans returning home to a country that didn't quite know what to do with them. She tried to imagine this man. His voice suggested someone perhaps in his 30s, navigating not just blindness, but the additional burden of having lost his sight in service to his country. Well, welcome to our little community, Dorothy called out from across the room where she was working on needlepoint. Always nice to have another soul who understands the territory. Thank you, Samuel said, and Margaret heard his footsteps moving through the room. The confident way he navigated the furniture, suggesting long familiarity with being blind. I look forward to meeting everyone properly. His footsteps paused near Margaret's chair, though she hadn't made any sound to indicate her presence. Ma'am, he said quietly, and she realized he was addressing her specifically. I hope you don't mind my asking, but are you reading Dickens? Margaret's fingers moved instinctively to the book in her lap. Great Expectations, she confirmed, surprised that he could identify it from a distance. How did you? Volume 2 of the Braille edition has a distinctive thickness, and the binding creaks in a particular way when you open it to chapter 20. I read it so many times during my own training that I'd recognize the sound anywhere. There was a note of gentle humor in his voice. Pip's adventures got me through some difficult nights. And did they help? Margaret found herself asking, Pip's adventures? Samuel was quiet for a moment, and she sensed he was considering the question seriously rather than preparing some easy, encouraging response. They reminded me that people can change their circumstances, even when those circumstances seem impossible. That sometimes the life you end up with is different from the one you planned, but that doesn't mean it has to be smaller. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a small loosening of a knot she hadn't realized was there. It wasn't hope, exactly, that felt too large and fragile to trust yet. But it was something like possibility, the first suggestion that perhaps the darkness didn't have to be the end of her story, but merely the beginning of a different chapter. I should let you get back to your reading, Samuel said, his footsteps beginning to move away. But I hope we'll have a chance to talk more. There's something about the way you listen that suggests you have stories worth hearing. As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Margaret sat in the quiet common room, surrounded by the gentle sounds of her fellow residents. Dorothy's needlepoint needle pulling through fabric, Tommy humming quietly to himself, the distant clatter of dishes being washed in the kitchen. For the first time since arriving at the school, she felt something other than resignation about her presence here. Perhaps Samuel Brooks was right. Perhaps the life she was building in this place didn't have to be smaller than the one she'd lost. Perhaps it could simply be different, shaped by new kinds of sight, guided by different stars, but no less real or meaningful for all its strangeness. Outside, snow began to fall, each flake invisible to Margaret's damaged eyes but audible in Quadua. The way it muffled sound and changed the quality of air that drifted through the window. Winter was deepening, but for the first time in months, Margaret found herself curious about what spring might bring. Samuel Brooks began his work at the Iowa State School for the Blind on a Monday morning when the January cold had turned the Windows into sheets of ice, and the radiators clanged like angry ghosts throughout the building. Margaret first encountered him not in the common room or dining hall, but in the workshop where she had reluctantly agreed to try her hand at basket weaving. A skill Miss Walsh insisted would be both practical and therapeutic. Practical for what? Margaret had muttered to Dorothy the previous evening. I can't imagine any scenario in my future that requires me to weave baskets. Maybe that's the point, Dorothy had replied with the gentle wisdom she'd developed during her months at the school. Maybe it's not about the baskets. The workshop occupied the entire basement level of the building, divided into sections for different crafts: broom making, bookbinding, woodworking, and what Mrs. Peterson cheerfully called domestic arts: sewing, knitting, and basket weaving. The air down there was thick with the scents of various materials, the sweet smell of reeds soaking in water, the earthy aroma of leather, the sharp bite of wood stain and glue. Margaret had been struggling with her first basket for nearly an hour, her fingers clumsy and uncertain as she tried to follow Mrs. Peterson's patient instructions about over and under weaving patterns. The reeds seemed to have a will of their own, springing back into chaos every time she thought she had them under control. The secret, a man's voice said quietly from behind her, is to think of it as a conversation rather than a battle. She turned, recognizing Samuel Brooks's voice from their brief encounter the previous month. I'm afraid I'm not very good at either conversations or battles lately, she replied, gesturing helplessly at the tangled mess in her lap. May I? He moved closer, and she caught that same scent she'd noticed before: leather and coffee, underscored now by something that might have been sawdust. I don't mean to intrude, but I spent a lot of time with basketry during my own training. It was the first thing that made sense to me after I lost my sight. Margaret nodded, then realized he couldn't see the gesture. Please, she said. I think I need all the help I can get. Samuel settled into the chair beside her, his movements economical and sure. The thing about basket weaving is that it's not really about vision at all. It's about tension and rhythm, and the way materials want to move. May I touch your hands? The question was asked so matter-of-factly that Margaret found herself extending her hands before she'd consciously decided to do so. Samuel's fingers were warm and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with tools and materials rather than papers and ledgers. They covered hers gently, guiding her grip on the reeds. Feel that? He said, applying slight pressure. The reed wants to curve this way. You're fighting it, trying to force it to go where you think it should. But if you listen to what it's telling you. Under his guidance, Margaret's hands began to find a different rhythm. The reeds, instead of fighting her, seemed to flow into place with a logic she hadn't perceived before. It wasn't vision that was required, she realized, but a kind of attention. She'd never learned to pay attention to texture, to resistance, to the subtle ways materials communicated their properties through touch. There, Samuel said softly, his hand still covering hers as they worked together. Do you feel how it wants to go now? Margaret did feel it, not just the physical sensation of the reeds moving into their proper positions, but something larger. A sense that the world she'd lost sight of was still there, still available to her, but through different channels of perception. It was like learning to hear music through her fingertips instead of her ears. How did you know? She asked, surprised, to find her voice slightly unsteady. How did you know that I was fighting instead of listening? Samuel's hands moved away from hers, but she could sense him settling back in his chair. Because that's what we all do at first. We try to impose our old ways of seeing onto a world that requires new ways of perceiving. It's natural to fight what we can't control. Margaret continued weaving, her hands now moving with a confidence that surprised her. What made you stop fighting? Time, Samuel said simply. And a very patient instructor who kept telling me that blindness wasn't a limitation, it was a different way of experiencing the world. I didn't believe him for months. But you believe him now? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret found herself holding her breath, waiting for his answer. Around them, the workshop hummed with quiet activity, the steady thump of Mr. Torres's broom-making machine, the whisper of Mrs. Chun's needlework, the soft scratching of someone sanding wood. "I believe that we're more than what we can see," he said finally. "I believe that sometimes losing one thing opens up possibilities for finding something else. But I also believe that it's the hardest thing in the world to trust that when you're in the middle of the losing." Margaret's hands stilled on her basket. "Are you in the middle of the losing, or have you found the something else?" "Some days one, some days the other," Samuel admitted. "What about you?" It was such a direct question, so free of the careful euphemisms and gentle encouragements she'd grown accustomed to, that Margaret found herself answering with equal directness. "I'm still losing," she said. "Every day I discover something else that's gone. But today, just now, I think I found something too." "What's that?" Margaret lifted her basket, running her fingers over the neat, even weave she'd somehow managed to create. "I found out that my hands know things I didn't know they knew." Over the following weeks, Samuel became a regular presence in Margaret's days, though never in an intrusive way. He would appear in the workshop when she was struggling with a particularly difficult technique, offering guidance that felt less like instruction and more like collaboration. He would materialize at her table in the dining hall, joining conversations that Dorothy had started, but adding perspectives that came from a different kind of experience, unlike the other residents, who had lost their sight to accidents or illness. Samuel carried with him the particular gravity of someone who had lost it in service to something larger than himself. He didn't speak often about Korea, but when he did, it was with the measured tone of someone who had processed trauma through reflection rather than bitterness. "The worst part wasn't the explosion," he told Margaret one evening as they sat in the common room, she working on needlepoint while he repaired a broken chair with tools that seemed to know their way around wood without guidance. "It was the months afterward, lying in military hospitals, listening to doctors talk about my prognosis like I wasn't in the room. What did they say? That I'd need to adjust my expectations. That I should be grateful to be alive and accept. That my useful life was essentially over. That the best I could hope for was to learn enough basic skills to avoid being a burden on my family." His voice carried no bitterness, just a kind of weary recognition of old wounds. "They meant well, but they were wrong about almost everything." Margaret set down her needlework. What were they wrong about? They thought blindness was the end of capability rather than the beginning of different capabilities. They thought independence meant doing everything the same way sighted people do it, just with accommodations. They felt the goal was to be as much like my old self as possible. "And what did you think the goal should be?" Samuel paused in his work, his hands resting on the chair's wooden seat. "To become who I was supposed to be, taking into account everything I'd learned, including blindness. Not to overcome it or compensate for it, but to integrate it into a life that made sense." These conversations began to reshape Margaret's understanding of her own situation. She had been approaching blindness as a problem to be solved, a deficit to be managed. But listening to Samuel, she began to consider the possibility that it might be something else entirely, not a subtraction from her former life, but an addition to her ways of knowing the world. This shift in perspective manifested in small but significant changes. Where she had once moved through the school's corridors with careful caution, she began to walk with something approaching confidence. Where she had once sat silently during group discussions, she found herself contributing observations that surprised even her. "You're different," Dorothy observed one evening as they prepared for bed. "Not just more skilled, though, you are that, but different in some essential way." Margaret considered this as she brushed her hair, a routine that had become both more important and more complicated since losing her sight. Without mirrors to guide her, She had to rely on the feel of the brush moving through her hair, the sensation of tangles being worked free, the weight and texture that told her when she was finished. "I think I'm starting to understand that this isn't temporary," she said finally. "For months, I kept thinking that if I learned the skills well enough, practiced hard enough, I could somehow get back to being who I was before. But that person is gone, isn't she?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "Does that make you sad?" Margaret thought about Robert, about Timothy and Sarah, about the woman who had once stood in a sunny kitchen making breakfast for her family while humming softly to herself. That woman was indeed gone, dissolved like sugar in water, leaving only traces of sweetness behind. "Yes," she said, "but also relieved maybe?" She was carrying so much weight, so many expectations about what she was supposed to be and do and want. This new person doesn't have to carry all of that. What does she have to carry? Margaret smiled in the darkness, surprising herself with the spontaneous gesture. "I don't know yet. I'm still figuring out who she is." The breakthrough came during a snowstorm in February, when the school was closed to outside activities and residents were encouraged to spend time in creative pursuits. Margaret had been working on a complex basket, one that required her to incorporate different materials and weaving patterns, when she encountered a problem that seemed insurmountable. She had been struggling for over an hour, growing increasingly frustrated as her fingers fumbled with what should have been a simple joining technique. The basket was nearly finished, but this one section refused to cooperate, and she could feel her old patterns of anger and self-defeat beginning to take hold. "Talk to me about what's happening," Samuel's voice said from beside her. She hadn't heard him approach, but somehow his presence felt expected rather than surprising. "I can't get this joint right," Margaret said, her voice tight with frustration. "I've tried it a dozen different ways, but something's not working. Show me what you're trying to do." Margaret demonstrated the technique, her movements sharp and impatient. Samuel listened, not just to her words, but to the sound of the materials, the rhythm of her hands, the quality of her breathing. "You're rushing," he said gently, "and you're trying to force the materials to do something they're not ready to do. Stop for a moment. Just stop." Margaret's hands stilled. Around them, the workshop was quieter than usual due to the storm, with only a few other residents working on projects. The sound of wind against the windows created a kind of cocoon of privacy. "Now," Samuel said, "instead of thinking about what you want the basket to do, think about what it's trying to tell you. Feel the tension in the reeds. Notice where they're pulling and where they're resisting." Margaret closed her eyes, a habit she'd developed even though it made no practical difference, and let her attention flow through her fingertips into the materials. Gradually, she began to sense what Samuel meant. The reeds weren't randomly resistant. They were communicating something about their limits, their preferred directions, their willingness to bend versus their need to maintain structure. "Oh," she breathed, suddenly understanding. "They're not ready for that joint yet. They need more preparation." "What kind of preparation?" Margaret's hands moved instinctively, performing steps she hadn't consciously planned. She dampened certain reeds to make them more pliable, adjusted the tension in others, created space for the joint to form naturally rather than forcing it into place. When she finally attempted the joining technique again, it worked effortlessly, the materials flowing together as if they had been waiting for exactly this moment. "There," Samuel said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "You didn't overcome the resistance. You listened to it until you understood what it needed." Margaret sat back in her chair, the completed basket in her lap, and felt something shift inside her that was deeper than technique or skill. She had just learned to see not with her eyes, but with her hands and her attention and her willingness to receive information through channels she had never trusted before. "Samuel," she said quietly, "I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant about different capabilities. Tell me, Margaret struggled to find words for the revelation that was still forming. Before, when I could see, I think I was only using a small part of myself to understand the world. I was so focused on visual information that I never developed. This, she gestured vaguely at her hands, the basket, the space between them. This way of knowing things through touch and attention and conversation, I guess. And now? Now I feel like I'm using more of myself than I ever did before. Does that make sense? Samuel was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if she had said something wrong. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. It makes perfect sense, he said. And it's the most important thing you'll ever learn about being blind. The loss is real, don't let anyone tell you it isn't. But so is the discovery. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the discovery turns out to be bigger than the loss. As the storm continued to rage outside, Margaret sat in the warm workshop holding her completed basket and felt, for the first time since losing her sight, that she might actually be lucky after all. Not despite her blindness, but because of everything it was teaching her about the vast, unexplored territories of human perception that lay beyond the narrow realm of sight. The woman she was becoming might not be the woman she had once been. But she was beginning to suspect that this new woman might be someone worth knowing, someone with capabilities and insights that the old Margaret could never have imagined. And in the quiet presence of Samuel Brooks, she was discovering that she wasn't walking this path of discovery alone. Spring arrived at the Iowa State School for the Blind with the suddenness of revelation, transforming the institutional grounds from a landscape of bare branches and frozen earth into something Margaret could experience as beautiful for the first time since losing her sight. She discovered this beauty not through vision, but through the symphony of returning birds, the scent of soil warming under longer days, and the way the air itself seemed to carry promises of renewal. It was during this season of awakening that Samuel made a suggestion that would change everything. "There's something I want to show you," he said one morning in late March, finding Margaret in the courtyard garden where she had taken to spending her free time. She'd been helping to prepare the vegetable beds for planting, her hands learning to distinguish between different types of soil, and her fingers becoming sensitive to the subtle textures that indicated proper planting conditions. "Show me?" Margaret straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. Over the past weeks, she'd grown comfortable with Samuel's way of speaking, his casual use of visual language that never felt like mockery or oversight, but rather like an invitation to understand that seeing encompassed far more than sight. "There's a place downtown," Samuel explained, settling onto the bench beside the garden bed where she'd been working. "A workshop where they make furniture, real furniture, not just institutional pieces. The owner is a friend of mine from the Veterans Hospital. He's been looking for skilled workers who understand wood and craftsmanship." Margaret's hands stilled. "You're talking about work." "Outside work. I'm talking about possibility." Samuel's voice carried the careful neutrality he used when discussing topics that might be sensitive. "Miss Walsh mentioned that you've been here almost 5 months now, that you've mastered the basic skills faster than most residents. She thinks you might be ready to consider what comes next." What comes next? The phrase hung in the air between them like a question Margaret hadn't dared to ask herself. She had become so focused on learning to navigate her new reality within the safe confines of the school that she'd avoided thinking about the larger world beyond its walls. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said quietly. "This place has become safe, predictable. Everyone here understands what it means to be blind." Samuel was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could sense him considering his words carefully. "Can I tell you something about safety?" he said finally. "After I was injured in Korea, I spent 8 months in a military hospital. Clean sheets, regular meals, medical care, people who understood my condition. It was safe, and for a long time, safe felt like the most I could hope for. What changed? I realized that safety and living aren't always the same thing. Samuel's voice grew thoughtful. The hospital kept me alive and helped me learn basic skills, but it couldn't teach me how to build a life. That had to happen out there, in the world where things are unpredictable and not everyone understands blindness, but where real possibilities exist. Margaret found herself thinking about the woman she'd been before, the one who had run a household, managed a family, navigated complex social situations with confidence. That woman had lived in the unpredictable world, had thrived there, even. Was it possible that some part of her still existed, waiting to be reclaimed and adapted to her new circumstances? "Tell me about this workshop," she said. Over the following week, Samuel shared what he knew about Hartwell and Sons Fine Furniture, a family business that had been operating in Iowa City for 3 generations. The current owner, Michael Hartwell, had lost his left arm in the Pacific Theater and had returned home determined to prove that disability didn't preclude craftsmanship. He employed several veterans and had developed a reputation for creating pieces that combined traditional techniques with innovative adaptations for workers with various physical limitations. Michael believes that different abilities lead to different approaches, and different approaches often lead to better solutions, Samuel explained during one of their evening conversations. He's not looking for charity cases or inspiration stories. He's looking for skilled workers who happen to be blind. The distinction was important, Margaret realized. She'd grown weary of being treated as either pitiable or inspirational, when what she wanted was simply to be useful, to contribute something of value to the world, rather than being perpetually on the receiving end of help and accommodation. "Would you come with me?" she asked, the words emerging before she'd consciously decided to speak them. "To visit the workshop, I mean, just to see, to experience what it's like." Samuel turned toward her, and though she couldn't see his expression, she sensed something shifting in his posture. "Are you asking as someone who needs an escort, or as someone who would like company?" The question forced Margaret to examine her own motivations. Was she asking for support because she felt incapable of handling the visit alone, or because she'd come to value Samuel's presence and perspective? The answer surprised her with its clarity. "Company," she said. "I'd like the company." They arranged the visit for the following Thursday, with Miss Walsh's approval and encouragement. Margaret spent the preceding days in a state of nervous anticipation, alternating between excitement and terror. She practiced her mobility skills with extra diligence, reviewed the woodworking techniques she'd learned in the school's workshop, and tried to prepare responses to the questions she imagined being asked. "You're overthinking it," Dorothy observed the night before the visit, as Margaret lay in bed rehearsing potential conversations. "You're not going to an interrogation. You're going to meet people who make things with their hands, just like you do." The morning of the visit dawned clear and warm, with the kind of spring air that seemed to carry promises of renewal. Margaret dressed carefully in her best dress, navy blue with small white buttons, one of the few pieces from her old life that still fit properly. She arranged her hair in the neat style she'd learned to manage without sight, and for the first time in months, she thought about how she might appear to others. The workshop was located in a converted warehouse on the edge of downtown Iowa City, accessible by a bus route that Samuel navigated with the easy confidence of someone who had long since made peace with public transportation. Margaret found the bus ride both terrifying and exhilarating, her first venture into the fully sighted world since arriving at the school. "There's a group of college students discussing philosophy 3 rows behind us," Samuel murmured as they rode, 2 businessmen arguing about baseball to our left. And the driver keeps humming what sounds like some enchanted evening under his breath. Margaret smiled, grateful for Samuel's running commentary that helped her build a picture of their surroundings. She'd learned that he had a gift for observation that went far beyond what most sighted people noticed. He heard conversations, identified emotions in voices, tracked the movement of people through space with an awareness that seemed almost supernatural. The workshop announced itself long before they reached its doors. Through the rich scents of sawdust and wood stain, the rhythmic sounds of hand tools and machinery, and an underlying atmosphere of purposeful activity. Michael Hartwell met them at the entrance, a man whose voice carried the particular warmth of someone who had found his calling and wanted to share it with others. "Samuel tells me you've been working with wood at the school," he said, shaking Margaret's hand with calloused fingers that spoke of hands-on work rather than desk-bound supervision. "What kind of projects have you been doing?" Margaret described her progression from simple basket weaving to more complex furniture repair, trying to convey not just what she'd learned, but how she'd learned it through touch and attention and the kind of patient listening that Samuel had taught her. "Interesting approach," Michael said. "Would you like to try working with some of our materials? I have a piece that needs detail work, something that might actually benefit from the kind of careful attention you're describing." The project was a jewelry box with an intricate inlay pattern that had been partially damaged. The repair required removing the damaged sections and replacing them with new pieces cut to precise specifications, work that demanded sensitivity to wood grain, attention to fit and finish, and the patience to work slowly and methodically. Margaret settled at the workbench, her hands exploring the damaged area, understanding through touch what needed to be done. Around her, the workshop hummed with activity, other craftspeople working on their own projects, the soft conversations of colleagues collaborating on problems, the satisfaction of tools being used by people who understood their capabilities. As she worked, Margaret found herself entering a state of concentration she hadn't experienced since before her illness. Her attention narrowed to the immediate task while simultaneously expanding to encompass the grain of the wood, the weight of the tools, the subtle resistances and yields that indicated when she was working with the material rather than against it. "Remarkable," Michael said quietly, observing her progress. "You're working like someone who's been doing this for years." "I feel like I am," Margaret replied, surprised by the truth of her words. "The techniques are new, but the attention isn't. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. The best craftspeople I know aren't necessarily the ones with the most technical training. They're the ones who know how to listen to their materials and let their hands follow what they're hearing." By the end of the visit, Margaret had successfully completed the repair, her replacement pieces fitting so seamlessly into the original pattern that Michael had to run his own fingers over the work to identify the new sections. More importantly, she had rediscovered something she'd thought was lost forever, the deep satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional with her own hands. "I'd like to offer you a position," Michael said as they prepared to leave. "Part-time to start, 3 days a week. We can work around any continuing education you might want to pursue at the school. The pay isn't much, but it's honest work, and there's room for advancement as your skills develop." Margaret felt something expand in her chest, not quite hope, which still felt too fragile to trust, but something like recognition. Recognition that the woman she was becoming might indeed be someone worth being, someone with contributions to make and purposes to serve. "I'd like that very much," she said. "When would you like me to start?" "Monday, if you're ready. Samuel can show you the bus route, help you get oriented to the neighborhood. After a week or two, you'll probably know it better than most sighted people." On the bus ride back to the school, Margaret sat in thoughtful silence, processing what had just occurred. She had not only ventured successfully into the outside world, but had been offered a place in it, not as a charity case or inspiration, but as a skilled worker whose contributions were wanted and valued. "How do you feel?" Samuel asked as they neared their stop. Margaret considered the question seriously. "Nervous," she said finally. "Excited, terrified, but also alive, more alive than I've felt since this all began." "That sounds about right for someone starting a new life." A new life. Not a reconstruction of her old life. Not a pale imitation of what she'd lost, but something genuinely new built on foundations she'd never known she possessed, incorporating skills and awareness she'd never imagined developing. That evening, as Margaret packed her few belongings in preparation for transitioning to a boarding house near the workshop, she felt the strange sensation of being poised between two worlds. The school had been a chrysalis, a place of safety and transformation where she'd learned not just how to be blind, but how to be a different kind of sighted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new possibilities for both failure and success. But tonight, for the first time in almost a year, Margaret Sullivan felt like someone with a future rather than just a past, someone whose story was beginning rather than ending. The woman climbing into bed was not the same one who had arrived at the school 5 months earlier. She was stronger, more capable, more aware of her own possibilities. She carried with her the scars of loss and abandonment, but also the hard-won knowledge that survival was only the beginning of what human beings were capable of achieving. And perhaps most importantly, she carried with her the friendship of Samuel Brooks, a connection that had begun in shared understanding and grown into something deeper, something that felt like partnership in the truest sense. Two people who had learned to see with more than their eyes, walking together toward whatever light awaited them beyond the safe walls of institutional care. The future remained uncertain, full of challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since losing her sight, Margaret was eager to discover what it might hold. The boarding house at 412 Elm Street stood 3 stories high with narrow windows and a front porch that sagged slightly under the weight of many Iowa winters. Mrs. Abernathy, the landlady, was a widow in her 60s whose voice carried the no-nonsense authority of someone who had managed difficult tenants and tight budgets for most of her adult life. She showed Margaret to her room on the 2nd floor with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had learned not to waste time on sentiment. "Rent's due the 1st of every month," she explained, guiding Margaret through the small space that would become her first independent home since losing her sight. Bathrooms down the hall, shared with the other 2nd-floor tenants. Kitchen. Privileges from 6 to 9 in the morning and 5 to 8 in the evening. No cooking after hours, no noise after 10, no gentlemen callers after 9. The room was spartanly furnished. A single bed with a metal frame, a small dresser with a cracked mirror Margaret would never use, a wooden chair by the window, and a wash basin on a corner table. It smelled of old wood polish and the faint lavender scent that Mrs. Abernathy apparently used in her cleaning supplies. "It's perfect," Margaret said, running her hands along the smooth surface of the dresser. And somehow, impossibly, it was. After months of institutional living, the simple privacy of her own space felt like luxury beyond measure. "Humph," Mrs. Abernathy snorted, though not unkindly. "Girl who thinks a 10 by 12 room with one window is perfect either has very low standards or has been through something that taught her the value of independence." Margaret smiled, probably both. Her first week of living alone was an education in the hundreds of small tasks that sighted people performed without conscious thought. She learned to organize her few possessions so that everything had a specific place and could be found by touch. She developed systems for distinguishing between different pieces of clothing, different coins, different canned goods. She practiced the route from her boarding house to the workshop until she could navigate it with confidence, counting steps and memorizing landmarks that existed for her ears and hands rather than her eyes. The work at Hartwell and Sons proved both challenging and deeply satisfying. Margaret's days settled into a rhythm of precise handwork that demanded her complete attention and rewarded her with the tangible satisfaction of creation. She specialized in detail work inlays, carvings, repairs that required delicate touch, and infinite patience. Her blindness, which had once seemed like an insurmountable obstacle, gradually revealed itself as an advantage in this kind of work. where sighted craftspeople might be distracted by visual imperfections or drawn to rush toward completion. Margaret's approach was necessarily methodical, thorough, attentive to subtleties that others might miss. "You feel things in the wood that I can't see," Michael Hartwell told her after she'd successfully repaired an antique music box with a mechanism so delicate that previous attempts had failed. "It's like you're having a conversation with the material that the rest of us can only overhear." Samuel visited her at the boarding house most evenings, and these visits gradually became the anchor around which her days organized themselves. He would arrive after dinner, announcing himself with a distinctive knock 3 quick raps, followed by 2 slower ones that she learned to recognize from anywhere in the building. They would sit on the front porch when weather permitted, or in the small common area when Mrs. Abernathy's rules required it, talking about their work, their past experiences, their slowly expanding understanding of what it meant to live as blind people in a sighted world. "Do you miss it?" Margaret asked one evening in late spring as they sat listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into dusk. "The visual world, I mean. Do you miss seeing sunsets and faces and all the things people talk about when they talk about beauty?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret had learned to value these silences. He never answered important questions quickly or carelessly. "I miss some things," he said finally. "I miss being able to read the expressions on people's faces when they're trying to decide whether to trust me. I miss the way light changed throughout the day, not just the warmth of sun on my skin, but the way morning light was different from evening light, how it painted familiar places in new colors. But I've discovered kinds of beauty I never paid attention to when I could see. The sound of wind in different types of trees. The way a person's voice changes when they're truly listening versus when they're just waiting for their turn to talk. The texture of really good wood under my hands." He paused. "The way you breathe when you're concentrating on detailed work, like you're syncing your rhythm to whatever you're creating." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest at this observation, that Samuel had noticed something so intimate about. Her work habits had found it worth mentioning, suggested a level of attention that went beyond casual friendship. "I've been thinking," she said, the words emerging before she'd fully planned them, "about my children. About Timothy and Sarah." Samuel's posture shifted slightly, not away from her, but into a more attentive stance. This was the first time she'd spoken of her children since their early conversations at the school. "What about them? I've been wondering if they think I'm dead, if that's what Robert told them to make the abandonment easier to explain." Margaret's voice remained steady, though she felt her hands trembling slightly. "I wonder if they remember me at all, or if I've become just a story their aunt tells them about their mother who got sick and went away. How old would they be now?" "Timothy's 5, Sarah's 7. Margaret calculated the months that had passed with the precision of someone who had counted each one. Old enough to remember, maybe, or old enough to try to forget. Samuel reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand. His touch was warm and steady, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. "What would you want them to know if you could tell them something?" The question opened a floodgate Margaret hadn't realized existed. "I'd want them to know that I didn't choose to leave them, that losing my sight didn't change how much I loved them, that every day I wake up thinking about what they're doing, what they're learning, whether they're happy." Her voice caught slightly. "I'd want them to know that their mother became someone different, but she never stopped being their mother. And do you think that's something you might want to tell them directly someday?" Margaret's breath caught. The idea of seeking out her children, of trying to re-establish contact, had seemed so impossible that she'd barely allowed herself to consider it. But hearing Samuel voice it as a possibility made it suddenly real, suddenly terrifying and hopeful in equal measure. "I don't know if I have the right," she said quietly. "They have a life now with Eleanor and Harold. Stable, normal lives. Would it be fair to disrupt that just because I've learned to live with blindness? I can't answer that for you, Samuel said. But I can tell you that children are usually stronger and more understanding than adults give them credit for. And I can tell you that knowing where you come from, even if it's complicated, is usually better than not knowing. Over the following weeks, the idea took root in Margaret's mind like a seed that had found fertile ground. She began composing mental letters to Timothy and Sarah, imagining conversations where she explained her absence and her transformation. She practiced describing her new life in terms that children might understand, how she'd learned to see with her hands, how work had become a kind of prayer, how she'd discovered that losing something important could sometimes teach you about parts of yourself you'd never known existed. The decision to actually reach out came not through careful planning, but through a moment of impulse that surprised her with its clarity. She was working on a particularly intricate inlay pattern, a yod, flowering vine that would decorate the lid of a hope chest, when her hands seemed to move of their own accord, creating not just decorative elements but recognizable flowers, daisies, for innocence, forget-me-nots for remembrance, morning glories for new beginnings. For my children, she found herself saying to Michael when he paused to examine her work, I'm making this for my children. That evening, she asked Samuel to help her compose a letter to Eleanor. Not a demand or a plea, but a simple request. For information about Timothy and Sarah's welfare, and perhaps permission to send them a gift, the hope chest she was creating, filled with smaller items she could make that might help them remember the mother they'd lost. I don't expect forgiveness, she dictated as Samuel wrote in his careful, practiced handwriting. I don't expect to resume a role in their lives that circumstances forced me to abandon. But I hope that someday they might want to know that their mother survived her illness, learned to live independently, and never stopped loving them. The letter was posted on a Tuesday morning in June. Margaret had expected waiting for a response to be torture, but instead found herself oddly at peace. She had taken action, had reached across the void that had separated her from her children. For over a year, whatever came back, rejection, silence, or something she dared not hope for, she had at least tried to bridge the gap. The response came 3 weeks later, delivered by Mrs. Abernathy with the careful neutrality she reserved for situations she didn't fully understand but recognized as important. Letter for you, dear, she said, placing an envelope in Margaret's hands. From Des Moines, looks like. Margaret's fingers traced the envelope, recognizing through touch the formal weight of good stationery. Samuel was visiting that evening, and she waited for his arrival before opening it, needing his presence for whatever news it might contain. Would you like me to read it to you? He asked gently. Please. Samuel's voice was carefully neutral as he read Eleanor's response, but Margaret could hear the surprise and something like relief underlying the formal words. Dear Margaret, I was shocked to receive your letter, as we had been led to believe that your condition had deteriorated beyond recovery. I am pleased to learn that you have regained your health and established independent living arrangements. The children are doing well and have adapted to their new circumstances, though Timothy still asks about you occasionally. Sarah has become quite artistic and often draws pictures of what she remembers about our family before your illness. I would be willing to arrange a supervised visit if you believe you are prepared for the emotional challenges such a meeting might present. The children deserve to know that their mother is alive and well, though I trust you understand that their stability and welfare must remain the primary consideration. There was more practical details about timing and arrangements, careful language about boundaries and expectations. But Margaret had stopped listening after the crucial information. Her children were well. They remembered her, and Eleanor was willing to facilitate contact. She said yes, Margaret whispered, hardly believing it. She's going to let me see them. Samuel folded the letter carefully. How do you feel about that? Margaret considered the question seriously. How did she feel about the prospect of reuniting with the children she'd been forced to abandon? of explaining her transformation to young minds that might not understand the complexities of adult choices and circumstances. Terrified, she said. Honestly, and grateful, and hopeful, and completely unprepared. She paused. But ready, I think I'm ready. Samuel reached for her hand again, and this time Margaret was struck by how natural the gesture had become, how his touch had evolved from comfort to something deeper: partnership, understanding, the kind of connection that existed between two people who had learned to navigate the world together. "You'll do well," he said simply. "You've learned how to see with your heart. That's exactly what they need from their mother." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, Margaret felt the strange sensation of her life coming full circle, not returning to what it had been, but incorporating all she had lost and learned into something new and whole. Tomorrow she would write back to Eleanor, would begin planning for a reunion that might heal old wounds or create new ones. But that represented the possibility of reclaiming her identity as a mother without sacrificing the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. The woman who would meet her children would not be the same one who had disappeared from their lives. She would be scarred, changed, carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom and the strength that comes from rebuilding oneself from the ground up. But she would also be someone who had learned that love persists beyond sight, that families can survive transformation, and that sometimes the most profound journeys begin not when we set out to find something, but when we learn to see what was there all along. Beside her, Samuel sat in comfortable silence, his presence a reminder that she would not face this reunion alone. Whatever came next, she had learned the most important lesson blindness had to teach: that human connection transcends the visible world, and that seeing with the heart reveals truths that eyes alone could never perceive. The train to Des Moines departed Iowa City at 7:15 on a Saturday morning in early July, carrying Margaret toward a reunion she had imagined countless times but could never quite envision. Beside her, Samuel sat with the patient stillness that had become familiar over their months of friendship, his presence offering strength without overwhelming her own courage. The hope chest rested carefully between them, wrapped in soft cotton, and secured with rope. 18 months of Margaret's most delicate work, translated into a tangible expression of love that had persisted across separation and silence. Inside, nestled in compartments she had crafted specifically for each item, were gifts that told the story of her transformation. A small wooden horse with Timothy's initials carved into its base, a jewelry box for Sarah with hidden drawers that opened to reveal tiny treasures, and letters written in Braille that Samuel had helped her translate into print words that attempted to bridge the impossible gap between the mother who had disappeared and the woman who had learned to live again. "Tell me about the station," Margaret said as the train began to slow on the outskirts of Des Moines. "What do you see?" Samuel's voice took on the careful observational tone he used when serving as her eyes. "Red brick building, older than the one in Iowa City. There's a clock tower, and the platform is longer, looks like it handles more traffic. I can see Eleanor near the far end, standing with 2 children. She's wearing a blue dress and holding what looks like a picnic basket." Margaret's breath caught. "The children, what do they look like?" "The boy Timothy, I assume, is wearing short pants and a white shirt. He's holding Eleanor's hand but leaning forward like he's eager to see something. The girl is a little taller, wearing a yellow dress. She's standing closer to Eleanor, more cautious." As the train pulled to a complete stop, Margaret felt time compress and expand simultaneously. Every moment of the past 18 months seemed to converge on this single point, walking down the platform toward the family she had been forced to abandon, carrying gifts that represented everything she had learned about survival and love and the possibility of redemption. Eleanor's voice reached them first, carefully controlled, but not unkind. "Margaret, I'm here with the children." Margaret moved forward slowly, her white cane tapping against the platform boards, Samuel a steady presence beside her. The sounds of the train station conversations, footsteps, the hiss of steam faded into background as her world narrowed to the space where her children waited. "Mama?" The voice was small, uncertain, but unmistakably Timothy's. Margaret's heart seemed to stop, then resume beating with painful intensity. "Yes, sweetheart," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Mama." The reunion unfolded, not with the dramatic embrace Margaret had sometimes imagined, but with the careful uncertainty of people relearning each other's contours. Timothy approached first, his child's curiosity overcoming hesitation, while Sarah hung back, studying this woman who claimed to be the mother she remembered, but who looked and moved so differently from that memory. "You can't see," Timothy observed, with the matter-of-fact directness of childhood. "Aunt Eleanor said you got sick and couldn't see anymore." "That's right," Margaret said, kneeling to bring herself closer to his height. "I got very sick, and it changed my eyes. But it didn't change how much I love you." Timothy considered this information seriously. "Can you see me with your hands? Like this?" He reached out and touched Margaret's face with fingers that were sticky with what smelled like peppermint candy. Margaret's hands moved gently to frame his small face, reading through touch the changes that 18 months had wrought. He was taller, his features losing some of their baby roundness, but his hair still stuck up in the same stubborn cowlick she remembered kissing every morning. "I can see that you've grown," she said softly, "and that you still don't brush your hair properly in the mornings." Timothy giggled a sound that reached into Margaret's chest and unlocked something that had been frozen there since the day Robert had walked away from her hospital bed. Sarah's approach was more cautious, her 7-year-old skepticism evident in the way she kept her distance while observing this strange reunion. When Margaret turned toward her, speaking her name gently, Sarah's response was barely audible. "You look different," she said. "Your face is different." Margaret's hand moved instinctively toward the scars that marked her cheeks and forehead, the permanent legacy of smallpox that had driven Robert away and made her a stranger to her own reflection. "Yes," she said simply. "The sickness left marks on my face. Does that frighten you?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could sense the child's internal struggle between the mother she remembered and the reality of who Margaret had become. "Aunt Eleanor says the marks don't mean you're still sick," Sarah said finally. "She says they're just part of how you look now." "That's exactly right," Margaret replied. "They're like freckles, only bigger. They tell the story of something that happened to me, but they don't change who I am inside." Eleanor had arranged for them to spend the day in a small park near the train station, a neutral space where the children could process this reunion without the pressure of familiar surroundings. That might highlight all that had changed. They spread a blanket under a large oak tree, and Margaret presented the hope chest with the ceremony such a moment deserved. "I made this for both of you," she explained, her hands guiding theirs to explore the smooth wood and intricate inlay. "Work. Inside are things I created while I was learning to live differently. Each piece has a story." Timothy's reaction to the wooden horse was immediate and enthusiastic. He galloped it across the blanket, making sound effects that drew smiles from the adults. But it was Sarah's response to the jewelry box that truly moved Margaret. The child's fingers traced the hidden compartments with growing excitement, discovering each secret drawer and tiny treasure with the delight of someone uncovering buried gold. "You made all of this?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Even though you can't see, I learned to see with my hands," Margaret explained. "Just like Timothy asked about earlier. My fingers learned to understand wood and tools in ways my eyes never did." As the afternoon progressed, the initial awkwardness began to dissolve into something more natural. Timothy peppered Margaret with questions about blindness with the relentless curiosity of childhood. How did she know what clothes to wear? How did she cook food without burning it? How did she know where she was going when she walked? Margaret answered each question honestly. sometimes demonstrating techniques she had learned. She showed them how she organized her belongings by texture and position, how she used sound and smell to navigate the world, how her white cane served as an extension of her sense of touch. "It's like having superpowers," Timothy declared after. "Watching her identify different coins by feel alone. You can know things without looking." Sarah remained more reserved, but Margaret sensed her listening intently to every word, filing away information about this transformed version of her mother. When Margaret mentioned her work at the furniture workshop, Sarah's interest sharpened. "Do you like making things better than taking care of children?" she asked, and Margaret heard in the question all the hurt and confusion of a child who had been abandoned. However, involuntarily, Margaret set down the sandwich she had been eating and turned her full attention toward Sarah. "Making furniture is something I do to earn money and to use my hands in ways that feel good," she said carefully. "But taking care of you and Timothy was the most important thing I ever did. Losing you both was the hardest part of getting sick, much harder than losing my sight." "Then why didn't you come back when you got better?" Sarah's voice was small but direct, cutting to the heart of the matter with the brutal honesty of childhood. Margaret felt Eleanor's attention sharpen and sensed Samuel's supportive presence, but she knew this was a question she had to answer alone and answer truthfully. "I didn't get better in the way you might think," she said slowly. "My eyes didn't heal, and my face stayed scarred. Your father couldn't handle having a wife who looked different and needed help with things. He thought it would be better for you to live with Aunt Eleanor and Uncle Harold, where you could have a normal family. But what did you think?" Sarah pressed. "I thought my heart was broken," Margaret said simply. "And I thought maybe your father was right that you deserved better than a mother who couldn't see you grow up or help you with normal things. It took me a long time to learn that I could still be your mother, just differently than before." Timothy had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention children reserve for conversations about their own origins. "Are you going to take us back now?" he asked. "Now that you learned how to be a mama again?" The question hung in the air like a soap bubble, beautiful, fragile, impossible to answer simply. Margaret felt the weight of Eleanor's gaze, the complexity of custody arrangements and legal realities, the children's need for stability balanced against their desire to understand their place in the world. "I can't take you back to live with me right now," Margaret said carefully. "You have a good life here with Aunt Eleanor and Uncle Harold, and it wouldn't be fair to change that suddenly. But I hope we can visit each other sometimes and write letters, and that you'll always know that your first mama loves you and is proud of who you're becoming." Sarah considered this answer seriously. "Could we visit you? See where you live and where you work?" Margaret's heart leaped at the possibility. "Would you like that?" "Yes," Sarah said with sudden decisiveness. "I want to see how you make things with your hands. I want to understand how you learn to live differently." Timothy nodded enthusiastically. "And I want to meet Samuel. Aunt Eleanor said he came with you and that he's your friend who helps you." Margaret felt Samuel's gentle amusement at being reduced to the friend who helps, but also sensed his understanding that children needed simple categories to make sense of complex relationships. As the afternoon drew toward evening and the time for departure approached, the dynamics among the small group had shifted in ways none of them had quite expected. The children had not magically reverted to treating Margaret as their primary parent, but they had accepted her as a permanent part of their story, someone who loved them and whom they could love in return, even across distance and changed circumstances. Eleanor's attitude had also evolved from careful supervision to something approaching warmth. "You've handled this beautifully," she told Margaret as they packed up the picnic. "I can see that you've truly learned to live independently. The children need to know that their mother is strong and capable, not someone to be pitied." The goodbye at the train station was tearful but not desperate. Timothy hugged Margaret fiercely and promised to write her letters, even though they'll be in regular writing, Not that writing. Sarah's embrace was more reserved but genuine, and she whispered in Margaret's ear, "I'm glad you didn't die. I'm glad you learned to see with your hands." As the train pulled away from Des Moines, Margaret sat with her head against Samuel's shoulder, feeling emotionally exhausted but profoundly satisfied. The reunion had not restored her children to her life in the way she had once dreamed, but it had accomplished something perhaps more important. It had established that love could persist across transformation, that families could survive even radical change, and that children were capable of understanding and accepting complexity in ways that adults often underestimated. "How was it?" Samuel asked gently as the countryside rolled past the windows. Margaret could not see but could sense in the changing quality of light and the rhythm of the train's movement. "Different than I imagined," Margaret said. "Better in some ways, sadder in others. But real. It felt real in a way that my dreams about them never did." Samuel's hand found hers, and they sat in comfortable silence as the train carried them back toward Iowa City and the life they had built together. Margaret carried with her now not just the memory of her children as they had been, but knowledge of who they were becoming. Sarah's thoughtful intelligence, Timothy's irrepressible curiosity, their capacity for adaptation and love. She also carried the understanding that she had not failed as a mother by surviving her illness and building a new life. Instead, she had given her children something invaluable, proof that human beings could endure devastating loss and still find ways to create meaning, beauty, and connection. In learning to see with her heart, she had become not just a survivor, but an example of what it meant to transform suffering into strength. The woman returning to Iowa City was complete in ways the woman who had left that morning had not been. She was a mother whose children knew her and claimed her, a craftsperson whose work had meaning and value, and a partner to someone who had helped her discover that love could deepen rather than diminish when built on mutual respect and shared understanding. As the lights of Iowa City appeared in the distance, Margaret felt the profound satisfaction of someone who had successfully navigated the most treacherous passage of her life and emerged not unscathed, but whole. The autumn of 1954 arrived in Iowa City with the kind of crisp clarity that made even ordinary moments feel significant. Margaret had been living independently for nearly a year now, and her life had settled into rhythms that felt both sustainable and meaningful. Her work at Hartwell & Sons had expanded beyond simple repairs to original design projects. Her correspondence with Timothy and Sarah had become a weekly ritual that anchored her weeks, and her friendship with Samuel had evolved into something neither of them had quite named, but both recognized as essential. It was during this season of comfortable routine that everything changed, not through crisis or loss, as had happened so often before, but through the quiet accumulation of moments that gradually revealed themselves to be building towards something larger. The first sign came on a Tuesday evening in October when Samuel failed to appear for their usual after-dinner visit. Margaret waited on the front porch of the boarding house, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening children being called in for baths, the distant sound of radio programs drifting from open windows, the soft shuffle of leaves across pavement. When an hour had passed with no sign of him, Margaret found herself walking to his own boarding house 6 blocks away, her cane tapping out the familiar route she had traveled dozens of times in his company, but never alone for this purpose. Mrs. Kowalski, Samuel's landlady, met her at the door with obvious concern. "Oh, my dear, he's taken ill," she explained, ushering Margaret into the small front parlor. "Came down with a fever yesterday, and today he's been too weak to get out of bed. I've been bringing him broth and tea, but he keeps asking if you've been by." Margaret felt something twist in her chest, not quite fear, but a recognition of how thoroughly Samuel's presence had become woven into the fabric of her daily existence. The thought of him suffering alone, asking for her, made her realize that what she felt for him had grown far beyond friendship or gratitude. "May I see him?" she asked. Mrs. Kowalski hesitated. It wouldn't be proper, dear. A young woman visiting a gentleman in his room. Mrs. Kowalski, Margaret said with quiet firmness. I'm a widow who has lost her sight and lived through more impropriety than most people face in a lifetime. I think I can handle visiting a sick friend without compromising anyone's reputation. Something in her tone must have convinced the older woman, because Mrs. Kowalski led her upstairs to Samuel's room and knocked gently before opening the door. Samuel, you have a visitor. The room was small and neat, smelling of the cedar sachets. Samuel used to keep his clothes fresh and the sharper scent of fever and medicines. Margaret heard him try to sit up in bed, the rustle of sheets and a soft grunt of effort. Margaret, you shouldn't be here. I might be contagious. She moved toward his voice, her hand finding the wooden chair beside his bed. I've survived smallpox, Samuel. I think I can handle whatever you've caught. She settled into the chair and reached out tentatively, her hand finding his forehead. The heat radiating from his skin confirmed Mrs. Kowalski's concern. This was more than a simple cold. Have you seen a doctor? She asked. Can't afford one for something that will pass on its own, Samuel replied, his voice rough with congestion. It's just a fever. Margaret's hand moved to his cheek, then to his throat, checking for swelling with the careful attention she'd learned to apply to everything in her sightless world. His skin was burning hot, and she could feel the rapid pulse that suggested his body was fighting something significant. This isn't just a fever, she said firmly. Mrs. Kowalski, we need to call Dr. Pemberton. Margaret, I can't, Samuel began, but she cut him off. You can, and you will. I have savings from my work, and I'm not going to sit here and watch you suffer from stubbornness. Her voice carried an authority that surprised even her. Besides, you've spent months helping me learn to live in this world. Let me return the favor. Dr. Pemberton arrived within an hour, the same physician who had overseen Margaret's recovery from smallpox. His examination was thorough and his diagnosis concerning pneumonia, serious enough to require careful monitoring, and treatment that would be impossible for Samuel to manage alone in his boarding house room. He needs constant nursing care, Dr. Pemberton explained to Margaret as they stood in the hallway outside Samuel's room. Fever management, help with fluids and medications, someone to watch for signs of breathing difficulty. I can arrange for hospital care, but it's expensive, Margaret finished. What would home nursing require? Someone staying with him around the clock for at least a week, possibly longer. Someone who understands the signs to watch for and isn't afraid of hard work. Margaret felt the pieces of a decision clicking into place with the same certainty she experienced when her hands found the right approach to a difficult woodworking problem. I'll do it, she said. Dr. Pemberton's surprise was evident in his voice. Mrs. Sullivan, I appreciate your concern for your friend, but nursing care requires ... requires attention to detail, careful monitoring, and the ability to follow instructions precisely, Margaret interrupted. Doctor, I managed a household and cared for 2 children while sighted. I've learned to navigate the world and perform delicate craftwork while blind. I think I can learn to take care of one sick man. What followed was a week that tested every skill Margaret had developed since losing her sight, and several she hadn't known she possessed. She moved temporarily into Samuel's room, sleeping in the chair beside his bed and learning to track his condition through the subtle changes in his breathing, the temperature of his skin, the rhythm of his pulse. Mrs. Kowalski proved unexpectedly helpful, providing meals and fresh linens while maintaining a tactful fiction that Margaret was merely helping with nursing duties, rather than essentially moving in with an unmarried man. The other boarders either didn't notice or chose not to comment on the irregularity of the situation. Samuel's fever broke on the 4th night, sometime in the dark hours between midnight and dawn. Margaret woke from a light doze to find his breathing easier, his skin cool for the first time in days. She pressed her hand to his forehead, then to his cheek, confirming what she had hoped. Better? Samuel's voice was weak, but clearer than it had been since his illness began. Much better, Margaret confirmed, settling back in her chair. How do you feel? Like I've been trampled by horses, he admitted, but clear-headed for the first time in days. There was a pause, and Margaret sensed him gathering his thoughts. Margaret, you've been here the whole time, haven't you? Where else would I be? At your own boarding house, at work, living your own life instead of camping in a sick man's room. Margaret considered her response carefully. Over the past week, as she'd monitored his fever and helped him sip broth and listened to his restless murmuring in the grip of illness, she had been forced to confront the true depth of her feelings for Samuel Brooks. What she felt was not gratitude, or friendship, or even the comfortable companionship she had initially valued. It was love, the kind of love that made caring for someone feel not like sacrifice, but like privilege. Samuel, she said quietly, this past week taking care of you has felt more like living my life than anything I've done since I lost my sight. Does that make sense? She heard him shift in the bed, could sense him turning toward her voice. It makes perfect sense, he said. Because I've been lying here thinking that having you nearby, even when I was too sick to appreciate it properly, felt more like home than any place I've lived since before the war. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither had quite voiced before. Margaret felt her heart beating faster, not from anxiety, but from the recognition that they were approaching something that would change everything. Samuel, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, what are we talking about here? I think we're talking about love, he replied with the same careful honesty he brought to all important conversations. I think we're talking about the fact that somewhere between learning to weave baskets and planning visits to your children, I fell in love with you. And I hope that maybe you've been feeling something similar. Margaret's breath caught. In all her imagining of this moment, and she had imagined it. Late at night when she allowed herself to hope for things that seemed too good to be true, she had never expected it to happen like this. In a boarding house room that smelled of medicine and cedar, with Samuel still weak from illness and her hair uncombed from days of inadequate sleep. I have, she said simply. I love you, Samuel. I love your patience and your wisdom and the way you helped me learn to see the world differently. I love that you never treated my blindness as something to overcome or pity, but as just another fact about who I am. And I love, Samuel said, his voice growing stronger, that you see possibilities where other people see limitations. I love that you turned survival into artistry, that you fought to reconnect with your children, not because you needed them to complete you, but because you had love to give them. I love that you moved into this room to take care of me without a moment's hesitation, as if there was no question that someone you loved might need you and you might answer. They were quiet for a moment, letting the weight of these declarations settle between them. Margaret felt as though she was standing on the edge of a new country, one she had glimpsed from a distance but never dared believe she might actually enter. Where does this leave us? She asked finally. Samuel's answer came without hesitation. It leaves us with choices to make. About whether we want to build a life together. About whether two people who have learned to live independently might want to try learning to live together. Over the following weeks, as Samuel recovered his strength and returned to his work at the school, they began to have the conversations that such a decision required. They talked about practical matters, whether Margaret would keep her room at Mrs. Abernathy's, or whether they might find a small apartment together, how to manage the logistics of two blind people sharing living space, whether their combined income would support the kind of life they wanted to build. But they also talked about deeper questions. What marriage would mean to people who had both learned to define themselves through independence, how to honor the lives they had built separately, while creating something new together. What it would mean for Margaret's relationship with her children, to introduce Samuel not just as a friend, but as a stepfather figure, The answer to the last question came in a letter from Timothy, written in his careful 7-year-old handwriting, and translated for Margaret by Samuel. Dear Mama, Aunt Eleanor says you and Mr. Samuel might get married. I think that would be good, because then you would have someone to help you, and he would have someone to help him, and maybe you could both come visit us together. Sarah says she wants to give you her permission because she thinks you should not be lonely. We are not lonely because we have each other and Aunt Eleanor and Uncle Harold, but you only had Mr. Samuel, and now if you marry him, you will really have him forever. Please say yes so we can call him Uncle Samuel. Reading Timothy's letter, Margaret felt the last piece of uncertainty dissolve. Her children, in their simple wisdom, had understood something that she had been afraid to fully embrace, that love was not a limited resource that had to be rationed carefully, but something that grew stronger when shared freely. Samuel proposed on a December evening as they sat in their favorite spot on Mrs. Abernathy's front porch, bundled in coats and blankets against the cold, but unwilling to go inside and lose the privacy the darkness provided. His proposal was not dramatic or elaborate, but perfectly suited to who they had become together. Margaret, he said, taking her hands in his, we've both learned to live alone, but I think we could learn to live together in ways that would make us both stronger and happier than we've ever been separately. Will you marry me? Margaret's answer came from the same place of deep certainty that had guided her best decisions since losing her sight. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will. They were married on a Saturday morning in February 1955 in a simple ceremony at the courthouse with Mrs. Abernathy and Michael Hartwell serving as witnesses. Eleanor and Harold made the trip from Des Moines with Timothy and Sarah, who served as flower girl and ring bearer with the solemn importance children bring to such roles. The reception was held in the common room of Margaret's boarding house, with cake baked by Mrs. Kowalski and music provided by Mrs. Chen on the old piano someone had donated to the residence. It was not elegant or elaborate, but it was filled with the kind of joy that comes from seeing two people who have survived loss and struggle choose to build something beautiful together. As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, Margaret and Samuel sat together in the room that would now be theirs, larger than either of their previous spaces. With windows facing east to catch the morning light, neither of them could see, but both could feel warming their faces as they woke. Any regrets? Samuel asked, his arm around her shoulders, as they listened to the house settling into quiet around them. Margaret considered the question seriously, as she considered all his important questions. She thought about the woman she had been before smallpox, the one who had defined herself entirely through her roles as wife and mother, who had never imagined she might be capable of independence or craftsmanship or love that was chosen, rather than simply expected. None, she said finally. I couldn't see then how much more I was capable of than I knew. It took losing my sight to learn how to really see myself, the world, what love could be when it was built on respect instead of need. Samuel pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Then we're both very lucky, he said. Lucky to have found each other, and lucky to have learned that sometimes the most beautiful things in life are the ones we never could have seen coming. Outside their window, snow began to fall, soft flakes that Margaret could hear whispering against the glass, each one unique and perfect and invisible to her eyes, but completely present to her heart, which had learned finally to see with the kind of clarity that transcends the merely visible and touches the eternal. 5 years had passed since Margaret and Samuel's wedding, and their small apartment above Peterson's bakery had become the kind of home that seems to generate warmth from its very walls. The space they shared was arranged with the precise organization that two blind people require, but also with touches of beauty that spoke to their understanding that a house becomes a home through attention to details that please the heart rather than the eye. Margaret's reputation as a craftsperson had grown beyond the confines of Hartwell and Sons. She now took custom commissions, creating pieces for customers who sought her out specifically because of her unique approach to woodworking. Way she listened to materials and created furniture that seemed to hold conversations with the rooms they inhabited. Samuel had been promoted to head instructor at the Iowa State School for the Blind, where his patient teaching methods and deep understanding of the challenges facing newly blind adults had made him invaluable to both students and staff. But it was on a crisp October morning in 1960, as Margaret sat at her workbench creating a music box for Timothy's 10th birthday, that their carefully constructed life received an unexpected visitor who would challenge everything they thought they understood about the reach of their influence. The knock at their door was tentative, almost apologetic. Samuel answered it to find a young woman whose voice trembled with nervousness as she introduced herself. "My name is Helen Morrison," she said. I heard about you from someone at the school, about how you lost your sight and learned to live again. I was hoping ... I was wondering if you might have time to talk with me." Margaret set down her carving tools and joined Samuel at the door, immediately sensing the deep distress in the young woman's voice. Helen Morrison was 23 years old, she explained, and had lost her sight in a car accident 6 months earlier. Unlike Margaret and Samuel, who had both received institutional support and training, Helen had been largely left to manage her adjustment alone. Her family, well-meaning but overwhelmed, had essentially turned their home into a protective bubble, where Helen was discouraged from attempting anything that might be difficult or dangerous. "They think they're helping," Helen said as she sat in the living room, accepting the tea Margaret had prepared. "They bring me everything I need, help me with every task, make sure I never have to struggle with anything. But I feel like I'm disappearing. Like I'm becoming less of a person every day instead of learning to be a different kind of person." Margaret and Samuel exchanged a look of understanding. They had both seen this pattern during their work with newly blind individuals' families, whose love expressed itself through overprotection, inadvertently creating dependency rather than fostering growth. "What would you like to be able to do?" Margaret asked gently. Helen's answer came in a rush, as if she'd been holding these dreams inside for months. "I want to cook my own meals. I want to walk to the store by myself. I want to go back to work. I was a secretary before the accident, and I know there must be ways to do that job without sight. I want to live in my own apartment someday, maybe. Even ... maybe even find someone who could love me as I am now." The last admission was spoken so quietly that Margaret almost missed it, but she heard in those words the echo of her own fears from years earlier, the belief that blindness made her somehow unworthy of love or incapable of offering it. "Helen," Samuel said, his voice carrying the gentle authority he used with his most frightened students, "everything you just described is not only possible, it's probable. But you're going to have to want it more than your family wants to protect you from it." Over the following months, Helen Morrison became a regular presence in Margaret and Samuel's life. What began as occasional visits for advice and encouragement evolved into a comprehensive informal training program. Margaret taught Helen to navigate her kitchen safely, to organize her belongings systematically, to approach household tasks with the methodical patience that blindness required. Samuel worked with her on mobility skills, teaching her to use a cane effectively and to build the mental maps that would allow her to travel independently. But perhaps most importantly, they showed Helen through their own example that blindness did not preclude joy, accomplishment, or love. She watched Margaret's hands move confidently over wood, creating beauty through touch and intuition. She observed the easy partnership between Margaret and Samuel, the way they complemented each other's abilities without diminishing their individual strengths. "How did you know?" Helen asked one evening as they sat together on the apartment's small balcony, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into dusk. "How did you know that Samuel loved you for who you were, not despite who you were?" Margaret smiled, remembering her own uncertainty about such matters. I realized that he never talked about my blindness as something to overcome or accommodate. He talked about it as just another fact about me, like having brown hair or being good with my hands. He loved the whole person I had become, including the parts that blindness had shaped. And you? Helen asked Samuel. How did you know Margaret would see you as a man worth loving, rather than just another broken soldier? Samuel was quiet for a moment, considering. She asked me to teach her things instead of asking me to do things for her, he said finally. She wanted to learn my skills, not rely on my assistance. That told me she saw me as capable and valuable, not pitiable. These conversations with Helen forced Margaret and Samuel to articulate insights they had absorbed gradually, to put into words the philosophy of blindness they had developed through experience. They began to realize that their influence could extend far beyond their immediate community, that the example of their lives carried lessons that might benefit others facing similar challenges. This realization led to an invitation that would transform their impact from local to significant. Dr. Janet Williams, a researcher at the University of Iowa who was studying rehabilitation methods for the blind, had heard about their informal mentoring of Helen Morrison and others. She visited them on a snowy December afternoon with a proposal that was both exciting and daunting. I'm organizing a conference, Dr. Williams explained, bringing together blind individuals who have achieved independence and professionals who work in rehabilitation. The goal is to develop better training methods based on real-world success. Stories rather than theoretical approaches. I'd like you both to be keynote speakers. Margaret felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Speaking to a room full of strangers about her personal journey felt overwhelming, potentially humiliating. But Samuel's hand found hers, and she drew strength from his steady presence. What would you want us to talk about? Samuel asked. Your philosophy, Dr. Williams replied. The approach that allowed both of you to not just survive blindness, but to thrive with it. The methods you've used to help others like Helen Morrison. The difference between accommodation and transformation. The conference was held in Chicago in March 1961, bringing together nearly 200 attendees from across the Midwest. Margaret had never spoken to such a large audience, and as she stood behind the podium feeling the attention of so many people focused on her, she felt momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were attempting. But as she began to speak, describing her journey from the train station where Robert had abandoned her to the life she had built with Samuel, she felt the same certainty that had guided her through her most difficult moments. The audience was completely silent, and Margaret sensed their attention not as judgment, but as hunger for hope, for practical guidance, for proof that the challenges they faced could be met and overcome. Blindness taught me that I had been living with only a fraction of my capabilities, she told them. I thought I was using my whole self to understand the world, but I was really only using my eyes. When I lost my sight, I discovered that I had hands that could read stories in wood grain, ears that could navigate by sound, a heart that could see truth more clearly than my eyes ever had. Samuel's presentation focused on the practical aspects of their approach, the importance of systematic organization, the value of learning from other blind individuals rather than relying solely on sighted instructors, the necessity of family education so that loved ones could provide support without creating dependency. But it was the question and answer session that revealed the true impact of their message. Person after person stood up to share their own struggles, their fears, their small victories and major setbacks. Margaret and Samuel found themselves offering not just advice, but hope. The kind of hope that comes from seeing living proof that the future could be different from the present. A young man described his terror of leaving his house alone. An older woman talked about her depression after losing her sight to glaucoma. A mother worried about caring for her children while managing her own recent blindness. To each person, Margaret and Samuel offered specific, practical guidance rooted in their own experience and refined through their work with others. The goal isn't to become as much like a sighted person as possible, Samuel explained to a man who was struggling with shame about using a white cane. The goal is to become the most capable blind person you can be. That's a completely different objective, and it leads to completely different results. The conference proved to be a turning point not just for many of the attendees, but for Margaret and Samuel themselves. They returned to Iowa City with a deeper understanding of their role as advocates and teachers, and with invitations to speak at other conferences, to consult with rehabilitation programs, to share their insights with a growing network of professionals and individuals working to improve outcomes for the blind community. Helen Morrison, who had progressed from fearful dependence to confident independence during their months of informal training, moved into her own apartment and returned to work as a secretary, using adaptive equipment and techniques that Margaret and Samuel had helped her master. She became, in turn, a mentor to others, creating a ripple effect of support and empowerment that extended far beyond what any of them had initially imagined. "Look what we started," Margaret said to Samuel one evening as they read letters from people they had met at various conferences, updates on achievements, requests for advice, expressions of gratitude for hope restored. The letters were written in Braille, standard print, and occasionally dictated to family members, representing a community of people who had learned that blindness was a challenge to be met rather than a sentence to be endured. "We didn't start it," Samuel replied thoughtfully. "We just proved it was possible. Each person who chooses growth over resignation, independence over dependence, is starting it for themselves." As Margaret and Samuel entered their middle years, their influence continued to expand in ways they had never anticipated. Margaret's furniture designs were featured in magazines that celebrated adaptive craftsmanship. Samuel's teaching methods were adopted by schools for the blind across the country. Together, they had become symbols of a different way of understanding blindness, not as tragedy or limitation, but as a different way of engaging with the world that could lead to insights and capabilities unavailable to sighted experience. But perhaps their greatest success was measured not in public recognition or professional achievement, but in the letters that continued to arrive from Timothy and Sarah, now teenagers, who wrote about their school activities, their friendships, their plans for the future, and always their pride in having a mother who had shown them that human beings could survive anything and still find ways to flourish. Timothy's letter for Margaret's 40th birthday captured something essential about the impact of her journey. "Dear Mama, I used to be sad that you couldn't see me grow up. But now I understand that you taught me something more important than what I look like. You taught me that people can change their whole lives if they have to, and that sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be the beginning of the best things. I hope I can be as brave as you if I ever have to be." On a quiet Sunday morning in the spring of 1965, Margaret sat at her workbench putting the finishing touches on a rocking chair she was creating for Sarah's 16th birthday. The piece was her most ambitious project, yet a chair that would grow with Sarah from teenager to adult, with adjustable features and hidden compartments that would reveal themselves over time. Samuel was at the kitchen table grading papers from his advanced mobility students, occasionally reading aloud particularly insightful or amusing responses. The apartment was filled with the comfortable sounds of two people who had learned to share space and purpose with complete compatibility. A knock at the door interrupted the peaceful morning, and Samuel rose to answer it. Margaret heard voices in the hallway, Samuel's familiar tones, and someone else, a woman whose speech pattern suggested both education and uncertainty. "Margaret," Samuel called, "we have a visitor. Someone who's driven quite a distance to meet us." The woman who entered their living room was perhaps 30 years old, and she introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Coleman from the University of Minnesota. She had been studying their work and following their influence on rehabilitation practices for blind individuals. "I'm here," Dr. Coleman explained, "to ask if you would consider a rather unusual opportunity. The university is establishing a new program, a comprehensive training center for blind adults that would incorporate all the innovations you've pioneered. They want you both to direct it." Margaret felt her hands still on the wood she had been sanding. The offer was enormous, far beyond anything they had imagined when they first began helping Helen Morrison learn to live independently. What would that involve? Samuel asked. Moving to Minneapolis, obviously. Working with a team of researchers and practitioners to create the most effective program in the country for helping newly blind adults achieve independence. Training other instructors in your methods. Essentially, formalizing and expanding everything you've been doing informally for years. Margaret and Samuel looked at each other across the room, and in that glance exchanged an entire conversation. About possibilities and responsibilities, about the life they had built in Iowa City, and the impact they might have on a larger scale. "Can we think about it?" Margaret asked. "Of course," Dr. Coleman replied. "But I hope you'll consider that your example has already changed hundreds of lives. This program could change thousands." After Dr. Coleman left, Margaret and Samuel sat together on their small balcony, weighing the decision that would shape the next phase of their lives. They had found happiness and purpose in Iowa City, but the opportunity to create something that could help so many others was compelling. "What do you think?" Samuel asked. Margaret considered the question with the same careful attention she brought to all important decisions. She thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived at the Iowa State School for the Blind Broken, abandoned, convinced that her useful life was over. She thought about the journey that had led her to this moment, when she was being asked to help create a program that could prevent others from experiencing that kind of despair. "I think," she said slowly, "that we've learned something too valuable to keep to ourselves. I think we have an obligation to share what we've discovered about the possibilities that exist within limitation." Samuel nodded. "Then we say yes?" "We say yes," Margaret confirmed. "We say yes to helping other people learn that blindness is not the end of sight, but the beginning of a different kind of seeing. We say yes to proving that human beings are more resilient and capable than anyone imagines. We say yes to love that creates rather than limits." As they sat together watching the sun set over Iowa City, Samuel describing the colors that painted the sky while Margaret listened to the birds settling into evening roost. They knew they were at the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The woman who had once sat crying on a train station platform, abandoned and broken, had become someone whose life served as proof that the darkest moments can give birth to the brightest possibilities. Their love story had become more than personal triumph. It had become a beacon for others navigating their own darkness, a reminder that hearts that learn to see clearly can illuminate paths that eyes alone could never find. In losing her sight, Margaret had gained vision. In helping her find her way, Samuel had discovered his calling. Together, they had created not just a partnership, but a legacy proof that love sees with perfect clarity when it looks through the eyes of the heart, and that the most profound light often shines brightest in the deepest darkness. The future stretched before them, full of new challenges and unlimited possibility, guided by the unshakable knowledge that they had learned to see what truly mattered. Not the world as it appeared, but the world as it could become when viewed through eyes that had been taught to see with the heart. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.